Live. It is Sunday, May 31st, 2020, 5 o'clock p.m. We are starting on time. It is a bright, gorgeous late spring day in Washington, D.C. I don't know how it is in Cape Cod or where our mystery
He's in
guest
Nashville.
is. Nashville, Tennessee. Is it a gorgeous day in Nashville,
It is.
Tennessee?
It's a beautiful day here.
Are there riots?
We had a peaceful protest yesterday that ended, and then there were some shenanigans. Our city hall was lit on fire. There was a statue of an old racist that was toppled in front of the Capitol building. So yeah, we've had some shenanigans here.
And is it a gorgeous day in Cape Cod?
Yeah, but all of the oak trees are throwing their spunk off into like the air, and everything is coated in like a fine yellow dust that makes you sneeze, and it's pretty unenjoyable at the moment to be outside.
So
that's their form of protest, exactly.
Can we say that there is that it is a beautiful day, but for the fine coat of yellow dust in
Yes,
Cape Cod?
Exactly.
Okay. So we do have some important murder hornet news. There has been another murder hornet sighting in the state of Washington. So,
what if it's just the same murder hornet and it's just very busy and it's just like this?
But while the president is tweeting about Antifa, it is murder hornets who are coming to get your mama. So
what if it's some other insect that's dressing like a murder hornet and instigating problems to make murder hornets?
Everyone's wearing masks. How do we know?
Outside agitators.
Right.
Coming in from out of state. You've never seen a murder hornet driving a car with a license plate, right? And so, it's all outside murder hornets, which brings us to the president's tweet of 12:23 p.m. today. He tweets, "The United States of America will be designating Antifa as a terrorist organization, capital T, capital O." So I thought there was a lot of response to this on Twitter that reflects non-understanding of the president's authority to designate terrorist organizations, what that conveys, what it doesn't convey, and what it means that the president designated Antifa as a terrorist organization or plans to. So as a public service, before we get started, thought I would give a little explainer on the authority to designate terrorist organizations and what separates that from the authority to tweet blather, which the president, by the way, also has. That's one of the key presidential powers that this administration has exercised. So the authority to designate terrorist organizations comes from the so-called material support statute, which criminalizes the provision of money or other material support. Material support can be all kinds of things, including volunteering for, joining, training with, supplying, or working for a terrorist organization, but it has to be a designated terrorist organization. The authority to designate a terrorist organization resides with the Secretary of State and also in conjunction with the Attorney General. And so if an organization is engaged in terrorism and it becomes designated by the US government, then it becomes a crime to give that entity material support. So what is the parameters of the designation authority? Well, it's really three things that you have to be in order to be a designated terrorist organization. The first one, there's this word that I keep leaving out of this, because the authority isn't to designate a terrorist organization, it is to designate a foreign terrorist organization. And in order to designate a terrorist organization, you have to designate that it's a foreign organization. So Number one, Antifa, to the extent that it's an organization at all, rather than a loose collective of people who get together, it isn't foreign, it's domestic, and therefore it is almost certainly not subject to designation under the material support statute. Number two, you have to designate that that the organization engages in terrorism. Now, Antifa has definitely engaged in violence. Whether it has engaged in terrorism is a little bit more of an interesting question. I suspect the administration could get by on that one. And the third is you have to designate that the actions are not offensive to or objectionable to the interests of the United States. That's a pretty broad brush one that you can make for anything. So number one, the president has no authority to designate Antifa as a foreign terrorist organization because it's not a foreign organization. Number two, does the president have the authority to designate domestic terrorist organizations? Answer, no. There is no authority to designate domestic terrorist organizations. You all should feel free to give material support to domestic terrorist organizations all you want. They're not designatable under the material support statute. So what is a presidential tweet that announces I am designating Antifa as a terrorist organization? It is meaningless blather. It is like saying, I am designating our guest, Radley Balco, as a terrorist. I have the authority to designate anybody.
Don't do that to our guests. No one's going to come on, Ben.
No. My point is,
I think it gives me some street cred, actually. So
I think it gives Radley some street cred, and I am allowed to designate anybody I want. I can designate Radley Balco an elephant. Number one, it doesn't make him an elephant. And number two, it doesn't carry any consequences. So what we have seen today is that A, the president can designate an organization as a terrorist organization, and B, it means nothing at all and carries no legal consequences of any kind, except that we are not allowed to have fun anymore. And so we have to have conversations like this. It's terrible. We have to talk about whether the president can label people terrorists. There's no fun. It's bad. It's terrible. He shouldn't be doing this. And in lieu of fun, we're going to be talking to Radley Balco, who has been designated an elephant on In Lieu of Fun.
I actually do a very good elephant impression. So
wait, really?
Let's see it,
please.
All right. Well, now there's a lot of pressure, but all right.
Oh,
it's more the sound than the image.
It's pretty great.
Yeah.
You could help Ben with his Rudyard Kipling stories that he reads to children every day.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty good.
Is that a first? Is that the first elephant impression on the show?
It is. We've had live bees on the show, but no elephant impressions.
All right.
It turns out that guy that you retweeted today. Oh, so I should introduce you. Let me do that first. Then I will get into this. The person that you retweeted with a comment that I thought was excellent. Everyone, this is Radley Balco. Radley Balco is hi. Radley Balco says hi to everyone. Radley is a friend of mine from way back in my DC days. And I think we just kind of hit it off over Johnny Cash and whiskey and kind of a very civil libertarian sense about rights and the police state. Although you had made your career about it already when we met, and you now have a full-time blog. It was formerly on Reason. Now it's at the Washington Post. Still column at the Washington Post.
Yeah, well, I went from Reason to Huffington Post to Washington Post. Yeah, and I've been at Washington Post for 6 years now, I think.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do commentary and then also reporting and I guess reported commentary.
And you wrote, I'm going to I hope I'm not misremembering. It was the name of your book, Dr. Death. Was that?
No, the lawyers made us change it. It's
yeah.
The Cadaver King and the Country Dentist is the book I co-wrote with Tucker Carrington.
Yes, and you wrote that. But even better, before that was The Rise of the Warrior Cop, which I think is so great and so timely for today in light of everything that's happening right now. And you're calling in from Nashville, where you live with your awesome wife and your 2 dogs.
Yep. My wife, Liliana Segura, is also a journalist who also does investigative reporting on the same issues. So we kind of cover the same beat. So,
is she still primarily working as like an abolitionist and covering death penalty stuff, or what is she is she broadening and doing other things?
Oh no, she's at The Intercept now. She just wrote a piece on COVID outbreaks in halfway houses. She's written a lot of wrongful conviction stories, forensics. We both write a lot about forensics and forensics reform.
I have like this entire part of my news cycle has like fallen away because it got so depressing. And then also I was doing enough depressing stuff covering social media and like all of the content moderation stuff. So I haven't like caught up with what you guys are both like, on the beat about, but we should have Liliana on.
Oh yeah, definitely. No, she'd love to come on. She couldn't today she was at the protest yesterday and she's working on a piece today. So, it's been interesting covering these issues because in the Trump era, you're kind of shouting into a hurricane in terms of getting a lot of attention for criminal justice issues. Although the last week that has dramatically changed. But I remember my first book. I mean, I did lots of TV, probably a couple dozen radio interviews. And for our second book, I think we did one radio interview with like a midnight TV show aimed at truckers that the segment immediately following us was about UFOs. So it's a little harder to get attention to these issues right now, but.
Yeah. So I'm kind of very curious just to get your take on everything that's happening. And I know that when I say everything that's happening, I mean everything from like, I guess we should probably start with the riots and particularly Minneapolis and kind of everything that's fallen out with the George Flynn death, and kind of talk about the videos that have been circulating today in particular that are really kind of showing police firing canisters into people's porches from the street, all of these things that are just kind of seem just really like, I mean, Rise of the Warrior Cop doesn't really even seem to cover it. I'm just really curious to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, well, I mean, that book kind of documents the how police became so sort of heavily armed and fortified, and the blurring of this line between law enforcement and the military. And it's a line that, like, throughout our country's history, we have generally respected. There have been some exceptions, some I think troubling, some not. Reconstruction, for example, the Union Army sort of ran the governments of a lot of the Confederate states, but that also was very, hopefully, unique and once in the country's history sort of event. But for the most part, I mean, this line has been appreciated, and the idea that a soldier's job is to kill people and break things, right? Is to annihilate a foreign enemy. A police officer's job is to protect our rights. And despite the best efforts of a lot of politicians who seem to think that the skill sets for those two jobs are interchangeable, we've resisted the merging of those two institutions, largely in respect because of resistance from the military, which I think is a very healthy thing. But the drug war, I think, in particular.
So hold on, just really quickly. Sure. What do you mean by resistance from the military? Like the military doesn't want to be police?
No, they don't. The military, particularly at the top of the military, there is a respect for the idea that the military should be led by a civilian, and that there's heavy resistance to using the military for domestic policing, and it's part of this long tradition, and it's also just something that free societies don't do. The military doesn't do domestic policing. I mean, that's why it was really the and I get into this a little bit in the book, but it was the British soldiers, the British Crown using British soldiers for sort of day-to-day policing that really pissed off the colonists, particularly in Boston, and sparked kind of the I don't know, the anger that led to the American Revolution.
No, I really remember that from like Gordon Wood's class in college. Like he was like, people don't like being policed by the same people that are supposed to be defending them.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, well, yeah. And so, you know, and the drug war is really where we start blurring this line, because we create these joint task forces where domestic police train with the military. And then it's during the Reagan administration that we start giving surplus military equipment to local police departments. That becomes formalized in the 90s, what's known as the 1033 program, where you had literally millions of pieces of military equipment have been transferred to police departments across the country. You combine that with civil asset forfeiture, which now provides an incentive to start using that equipment to bring more money back to the police department. And what you get is this dramatic rise in the use of the number of and use of SWAT teams across the country. And Peter Kraska, a criminologist at Eastern Kentucky, has documented this. I mean, it's a hugely dramatic rise in the number of SWAT teams. You get a shift in the use of SWAT teams, whereas they were previously used to apprehend someone who was in the process of committing a violent crime. So you think of a spree shooter, a bank robber, or a hostage taker, to serving drug warrants, which is basically a way of investigating someone who is still merely suspected of a nonviolent crime, which is a very dramatic shift in how that kind of force is being used. And so, with that has come kind of, I think, a general kind of more militaristic approach to how police do their jobs. I mean, I think when you talk about police militarization, on the one hand, you can talk about the gear, the equipment, the idea that, you know, some police departments have 50 caliber guns for domestic policing, which is absurd. But there's also the mindset problem, right? If cops start seeing themselves as soldiers, and if the people they're policing see them as soldiers, you fundamentally change that relationship between the police and the policed. And I think that's what we're seeing in these protests. I mean, I don't recall ever seeing so many videos of police directly targeting journalists after they have declared themselves as journalists and shooting them. I mean, with rubber bullets, but still, you know, directly targeting people after they've identified themselves as media. I think that's a very
It's bizarre. I've never seen this either. And I was like, am I not paying attention enough? But like, Ben, do you remember anything about this type of thing?
No, I don't. And I think the first incident, you say, you know, maybe
It was
that's
a
an
mistake or
accident,
like
maybe it's
whatever.
but the rash of them is very hard to explain. And as anything other than, I'm not sure the explanation is militarization as opposed to out of control rage on the part of police.
Oh,
But
yeah.
I agree with you. I mean, there's a bunch of aspects of the police response to these protests that are just very hard to understand. That's one. Another is just the number of random bystanders who seem to be being attacked, including old people and children. And then that's before you get to the ramming incident in New York, where a police car really just seems to have plowed into a crowd. And
I missed that one. Bradley, you're gonna have to like, yeah, someone.
It's pretty horrifying, yeah.
Really?
It's pretty appalling. And so you know, and there's a few aspects of it that are of this collection of issues that are very troubling. The most important of which, from my point of view, is that they're not all being done by the same police department, right? So, you know, it would be one thing if the Minneapolis Police Department were having murdered this man, was now reacting very badly to protests against it. And then you can say, okay, there's a problem in Minneapolis. But this seems to be if not quite a national phenomenon, in the sense that there are certain jurisdictions where the protests have been peaceful and the police have been respectful. So I think we should acknowledge both the protesters and the police in those jurisdictions. That said, it's certainly a multi-jurisdictional phenomenon, and it's a multi-state phenomenon. And I don't think you can look at it and say this is a just a few rogue actors.
But to Barry Friedman's point the other day, sorry, do you know him, Bradley? He's
Yep.
you should. Yeah. He was wonderful. He was on Friday, and we had this what?
He's a Nashville guy.
Oh yeah, is he? Oh, that's funny. But he kind of was talking about, we were kind of talking about like he does these ride-alongs with police, and there's really good kind of ride-alongs with police of like here are like sterling officers, and you go out and they're like very good at de-escalating the situation and showing you around. And then there's also these kind of rogue officers that are from the Shield or something, like straight out of the Shield or something, and he never gets to see those. And this, I feel like, is both this, I mean, what Ben just said about how we're seeing all of these kind of terrible actors and these bad moments from every police force across the country, more or less. It's like it is to say that like not all police, but it is all police, but not all police at every, like there are factions of bad actors at every single police station. It almost feels like. And like, it kind of has a very, to me, like a very kind of provable point here, which is that like, it both should satisfy everyone that like, there are just some really shitty people that get overrun with power almost everywhere. And those are the people that we should be targeting this at rather than like the police writ large. Am I being like overly generous or overly harsh or?
No, I think the problem, there are good cops, there are bad cops, right? I think the problem is that policing as an institution has been set up to make it virtually impossible to kick the bad cops out of policing, right? And so because of that, and policing has also become, for reasons that I think politicians deserve a lot of blame on it, but policing has become one of the most sort of psychologically isolated professions I can think of.
What do you mean by psychologically isolated?
I mean, in terms of you almost, although this case was an exception, but you almost never see police officers criticize other police officers when one of these high-profile incidents happens. Now, this one, there actually was quite a bit of that, and that's refreshing to see. But in terms of the willingness to sort of, or the readiness to sort of take offense to criticism of one cop as a criticism of all cops, there's this very kind of militaristic mindset that you see among police. It's not so much protect and serve, but a phrase you see over and over again if you're on police forums or you see police officers on Twitter is whatever I have to do to get home at night. And the interesting thing is that this mentality, this kind of us versus them, everybody's out to get us mentality, has taken over policing at a time when policing has actually gotten a lot safer. The number of police officers, even the raw figure, it goes up and down from year to year, but the general trend is a dramatic line downward. And assaults on police officers are also down. You could argue that maybe better gear is saving more lives, and that's why more aren't being killed. But assaults on cops proportionally are also down. And yet we see this kind of increasingly antagonistic, and it's because they're being criticized. It's because finally there is some transparency. We're seeing cell phone videos. We're seeing more protests. We're seeing more efforts to hold police accountable. And it's a profession that has been closed off to that for a very long time.
I just want to say, go ahead, Ben.
Go ahead, Kate. Sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that Chris Parles posted the video and I just watched it, and it is indeed really horrifying. Like, it's actually crazy.
Really horrifying.
It kind of makes you realize, like, that phrase that like my dad used to say, which was like, when I'd go out, he was like, you can be afraid of a lot of things, but like a motor vehicle is like a lethal weapon. Like, and you can be like, and I'd be like, okay, like, all right, Dad, I'm going to be careful driving. But wow, you can kind of see the power of that. Like, you're just going to run over some people. Like,
and the irony of that video is that, I've written about, I can't even count how many cases where, the police were, trying to close in on somebody and a vehicle was trying to get away, and they drove away, and the police fired on them and killed them and claimed that, they were using their car as a weapon. In a lot of those cases, the person was just trying to flee from the police, and they jump in front of the car or, but yeah, it's, there's one thing I wanted to point out on protests, though, and particularly how police respond to protests. For the book, I interviewed a lot of police chiefs across the country, current and former. And overwhelmingly what I found from interviewing them is that when you respond to a protest sort of expecting violence and conflict, it becomes self-fulfilling. If you respond to a protest by having your officers come out in their regular uniforms, they don't have the riot gear. Now you have to have the riot police nearby and present, but you keep them out of view. And I've talked to lots of police chiefs who have had success, policing protests without any violence. And a lot of times the police chief, we saw this in Atlanta actually the other night, the police chief himself or herself will go out and talk to the protesters ahead of time and say, look, here's what we expect. The former police chief in Salt Lake City, who's a really great guy, was saying he would tell his officers before a protest, he would say, your number one job is to facilitate their right to free speech. It's not to protect the city. We're not even going to assume that it's going to get to that. If it does, we'll deal with it. But your job is to facilitate their free speech rights. And that's a totally different way of heading out to a protest. And it has to affect the mindset of the officers who are going to that protest. If they go thinking there's going to be violence and anger and people are going to throw shit at us, they're going to come with that sort of same mentality. When you come with a face shield or a mask, in the COVID era, it's a little bit different. But before that, if you're a cop in a uniform, you have green eyes and, a mustache and you look like a person. You come in your riot gear, you're just like a robot. You're the sort of faceless representation of everything the person is there to protest. And so I think that's, sorry, go ahead.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, I live in a city where, number one, in the 90s, we had a lot of police shootings, and the Washington Post actually did it was well before the issue of police shootings was a one of national attention, did this incredible series about sort of analyzing and dissecting a whole series of police shootings in Washington, many of which were very hard to justify. And I think successive leadership of the Metropolitan Police Department in the district has made a huge difference. And some of the attitudes that you're describing definitely play a role in that. And, I think it is not, I would never say there are not police community tensions in Washington, because there are. But I do think that one thing that conditions them in a downward direction is that, DC police, by the nature of the entity or the enterprise, do a lot of protecting of protesters and a lot of monitoring of protests. And there's this, familiarity with that tool and that project. And I wonder if some of what we're seeing is police departments that don't have day-to-day familiarity with angry protests, suddenly dealing with angry protests that are angry at them, because what sparked this protest is a police murder of a civilian. And now, mind you, it was a police, it's not the police in whatever jurisdiction this is happening, but it is, unless you're in Minneapolis, but it is, it is a feeling of protesting against the police and police violence. And I do think that requires a lot of discipline on the part of the police, and it requires a lot of respect for the sentiment that people are experiencing that, they may not be trained to, or they may not be adequately trained to.
Yeah, I think having police from the community that they're policing helps, because then they can see themselves in the people they're policing, and the people they're policing can see themselves in the police. I think that's a really important part. I think what you say about DC is entirely spot on. One of the people I interviewed in the book was the former police chief in DC, Jerry Wilson, in the early 70s. And he's a fascinating guy. I think he may have passed away since the book came out, but he, the Nixon administration wanted to push all these really sort of tough on crime policies, no-knock raids. This was kind of the birth of the no-knock raid, and a lot of like anti-protest policing. And of course, the federal government has jurisdiction over DC. And so Nixon wanted DC to be his sort of test city for all these policies. And Wilson refused. He said, I'm not going to be part of this. And, he's the one that told me about, when you go to a protest, you have your riot team nearby, but you put them in a bus in an alley. And so they're close that things got out of hand, but you don't go to a rally expecting violence. And DC did not have the problems with rioting in the early 70s that a lot of other cities had. And it's also worth pointing out that crime actually went down in DC during his tenure, while it went up in most of the rest of the country. Now, I don't think that's because of his policies, but it definitely didn't cause a spike in crime either.
As a really broad principle, it seems like something that you're saying and a lot of people say, which is, and I don't want to kind of be too reductionist about it, but it kind of seems like, when in politics or policing or content moderation or whatever it is that we're talking about, when you kind of have some sense of what the other person is feeling and can have some sense of empathy, that you do a better job, and everything is de-escalated and that things go forward. And what's amazing to me is that this is this unifying theme across almost everything, yet I do not feel like this is a principle that is taught, or if it is taught in schools, or in general, maybe it doesn't need, maybe you need it to be taught from a different place. But I do, there have been a few videos circulating about, there was this one, I did watch this one, actually, Lisa Page sent it to me, that was about a 31-year-old Black man fighting with a 56-year-old Black man and a 16-year-old Black man. And they're both they're all trying to protest. And the guy is trying to reason with the 50-year-old, and he can't. The 50-year-old's no, I'm just angry. I'm angry. And he just finally gives up and almost in tears, turns to the 16-year-old and is just this is you. We've been angry always. I'm angry. He's angry. You're angry. It's not going away. This can't be the way that we keep dealing with this, because nothing changes and we're still just angry, and it's up to you and your generation to do this. And I kind of it hit me. I'm but we're not building any of those tools for people to be heard, or for people to no one has let off the steam and anger of being repressed by jogging down your street, or going birding in Central Park, or being all of your ancestors being enslaved. We don't we don't need maybe monetary reparations, but a giant kind of catharsis of some sort, in which people really understand where people are coming from without all the language and everything else. I don't know. There's just part of me that's just why haven't we put any energy into that? And we put all this energy into the warrior police.
I mean, I got to say, I would settle for no national catharsis, but we stop killing people.
Right. Yeah.
I actually go ahead.
I think empathy is a big part of this. And unfortunately, empathy has become this kind of dirty word. You think back to the Sonia Sotomayor hearings, where she talked about, applying empathy with the law. And there was just such this backlash against the very notion. And the thing about empathy is, empathy doesn't always mean you excuse people's behavior. It means you try to consider things from their point of view. You try to put yourself in their shoes. And, I write a lot about policing and Supreme Court opinions on policing. And the Supreme Court, they often don't understand policing at all. They don't. And I think this is the fact that there aren't any criminal lawyers on the court, and there hasn't been a criminal defense lawyers probably since Thurgood Marshall. But just being able to see things from other people's point of view, I think, would help a lot. If you look at policing cases, they get things wrong about policing all the time. They talk about, the kind of instantaneous decisions that police always have to make, and that's not. Studies have shown that that's not sort of a regular part of the job. They talk about the roadside ambushes when they talk about police searches on after traffic stops, and those things they happen, and when they happen, they make a lot of news, but they're almost infinitesimally rare in terms of what our cops should be considering in their day-to-day job. And so there's so many of these decisions that don't actually look at how, for example, incentives play out on the ground. If you're a police officer, they don't look at what what it's like. And you can empathize with being a protester or even a rioter, and you can empathize with being a police officer. It doesn't mean you endorse their behavior. It's just an effort to actually try to see things from somebody else's point of view. And I think that like we could all, benefit from that, from actually trying to kind of step out of our own world. And unfortunately, particularly on the right, where, I am I think I sort of have one foot in the right. Empathy has become this dirty word that means sort of, always talking about your feelings and
is that true? Is that like, is it really that like, it's like, I mean, I know a lot of the dirty words in the right, but I didn't know that that was one of them.
Oh yeah, I mean, since the Sotomayor hearings, anytime somebody talks about empathy, there's always a lot of derision and sort of eye rolling, and it's not a. I mean, you go on the Fox News show and say we need to show more empathy. I think you'll probably be ridiculed.
Yeah, I'm really sure that everyone's going to be really sympathetic to my like national kumbaya that I just like kind of like reported.
Yeah, I think white people. We're three white people here. I mean, I think we could do a lot less talking and a lot more listening. Definitely. I mean, I think we should listen more to what protesters are saying and what people are complaining about, and try to actually see things through their eyes. I mean, I always point to, when I argue with conservatives about things like racial profiling, I point to Tim Scott, the very conservative Republican senator from South Carolina, who gave this very moving speech on the floor of the Senate a few years ago, describing how he's been racially profiled and how he'd been pulled over, I don't know how many times it was, in DC and around DC, and how his chief of staff had to buy a less expensive car because he was getting harassed so much by police. And I asked people on the right, do you think Tim Scott was lying about that? And of course they say no, because he's a good, respected conservative. And it's, well, then why is Tim Scott telling the truth about being profiled, but all these other Black people aren't? And that's the thing is, and this is the piece I wrote for the Post last week about why there aren't protests after white people get shot by police. And the reason why is because as white people, we can look at a white person getting shot by the police unjustly and say, that's terrible, and we can feel bad about it, and we can move on from it. If you're Black, you probably have had an experience with police sometime in your life where that watching that video of, say, to George Floyd, and you think that could have been me. That easily could have been me with that time that I got stopped, and that cop seemed to be really angry with me. And I think trying to see that and understand that would help us sort of understand what's happening in cities across the country right now.
Yeah. Margaret Taylor, former guest on In Lieu of Fun, among your other sparkly accomplishments. The floor is yours.
So thank you so much for coming on the show, Radley. It's so timely. I'm wondering if you could talk about what you know about the history of the provision of military style equipment from the federal government. And I have a question of, is there training also that comes from the federal government and its impact on domestic policing?
Yep, I would be happy to talk about that. So I mentioned it a little earlier, the 1033 program is this program where surplus military equipment is made available to police departments across the country pretty much for free. Usually they just have to pay for the shipping, or they have to make arrangements to come get it. And a lot of it's innocuous stuff like office equipment and computers and whatnot, but a lot of it is gear that was designed for use on a battlefield. One of the big pieces of equipment that we've seen since the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq are MRAPs, these giant vehicles that are designed to withstand roadside, improvised explosive devices. And the thing about MRAPs is they're not designed for city streets. They tear up the streets. They also roll over very easily. They have a very specific purpose, which is to be in a convoy and be able to withstand these explosions. And yet they're being given to these departments across the country, no training. Most of them didn't know, how to operate them. They have really expensive upkeep. And that's kind of what has happened with all of this gear. They get guns that are designed for use on a battlefield, things like the 50 caliber, machine gun I mentioned earlier. They get bayonets, weirdly. Bayonets are a very popular item that police departments like to get from the military.
They look cool.
What?
Yeah, they
don't look
cool.
that cool.
Well, that goes back to the point I made earlier, which is that there are two problems with this, with this use of this equipment. And one is the gear itself, which is not designed for use in a domestic policing environment, and a lot of times is wholly inappropriate for it. But also there is the image problem. A lot of people made fun of the Obama administration because they tried to put restrictions on this gear and how it was being transferred. One of the restrictions they made was that the equipment could not be camouflage, and if it was camouflage or that sort of camouflage green color, it had to be painted a different color. And a lot of people sort of mocked that, and I thought it was actually very thoughtful, because if you take a police officer and you dress him like a soldier and you arm him like a soldier and you tell him every day that he's fighting a war, whether it's a war on drugs or a war on crime or a war on terrorism or a war on Antifa, he's going to start to think of himself as a soldier, and he's going to start to think of the people he's supposed to be protecting not as citizens with rights, but as an enemy, to be controlled. And then that the communities start seeing the police that way as well. I mean, it's a big difference between seeing, a cop in his like sort of police blues, walking walking a beat with his, nightstick, and seeing a cop in sort of camouflage, carrying a heavy weapon, wearing, military fatigues, military boots. People start to see themselves as being sort of an occupied territory and not, a neighborhood. And that's the mindset effect, I think, is way underestimated. It's a huge part of this.
I love Margaret's question because I also think that it leads into a sequel for your book, which is just kind of like something like the secret civil war, you just have to write about like this distinction between civil wars and policing and actual kind of foreign enemies. It's everything that Ben led off with today.
Also, all the hulking 50 caliber guns that have no application in domestic policing but have to be maintained, and they're sitting there rusting somewhere with somebody who's deployed to do maintenance on them for no apparent use.
Yeah, that too. And it becomes very expensive. I mean, a lot of police departments have tried to give their MRAPs back because it costs so much to maintain them.
This is kind of like, it's like, is it like boats and horses? Like the best day is the day that you get the MRAP, and like the second best day is the day you give the MRAP away.
Well, I mean, look, it's true. Like they're not any different from a standard sort of armored truck, except they're a lot bigger and they're a lot more intimidating. And there are interviews with police chiefs and sheriffs who have gotten these who said the intimidation is like part of why they want it, because they want to, scare the criminals. But, when you're driving that through your town, it doesn't look good. And so, but also to get back to Margaret's question, so the 1033 program is what started all of this and what got us moving in that direction, along with the drug war and a lot of war rhetoric that we've seen from politicians. But now most of the equipment, the 1033 program is still in operation. Obama tried to sort of phase it down. Trump reversed all of that. But they're also now DHS offers grants to buy a lot of this equipment from independent manufacturers. So now you've created sort of a cottage industry of kind of militarized gear for domestic policing, which, is going to kind of perpetuate itself. A lot of police departments now like raise money to buy this kind of stuff. So they get it from everywhere now. So ending the 1033
what, with like brownie sales or like what?
I think would be important. They'll get donations from private organizations, from corporations sometimes.
Civil asset forfeiture.
Civil asset forfeiture, huge one.
Civil asset forfeiture. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. God, that is not written about enough. Anyway.
Well, and that also has perpetuated the militarization thing, because it's like you get all this gear, you start a SWAT team, a SWAT team is only supposed to be used in these really rare situations where somebody's life is in immediate danger. But if you start using the SWAT team to serve drug warrants, you can start making money that goes back to the police department to help pay for the upkeep and maintenance of the SWAT team. So it becomes this kind of problem that feeds on itself.
So all of this seems to reflect this dichotomy that we were talking about the other evening between cop as warrior and cop as social worker. And what my thesis was the other night is that the best police work is fundamentally very close to social work. and the work that people really want police work to be, and what the police unions advocate for, is a very aggressive kind of non-social work oriented police work. So if you could snap your fingers and turn every person who's a trained clinical social worker into a cop tomorrow and have them unarmed, so that you could, like, the National Police Department would tomorrow be composed of however many thousand people work for the National Police Department, but they would all be licensed clinical social workers with no weapons.
Right.
Would you do it?
Yeah. I mean, I think there would be gaps. I don't think it's a perfect solution. I'm not a complete police abolitionist. I do think there are situations where, you know, you do maybe need some sort of armed, I don't know, keepers of the peace. But I do think, you know,
they could bring the knuckle draggers in when they need to. But the fundamental job,
well, I mean, the question is a little bit,
British cops still don't carry guns.
Right. So your question is a little bit difficult. I want to offer a few different answers that are somewhat contradictory. I mean, one, there is this problem that we are asking police to do too much. So, you know, when somebody is suicidal or having a mental breakdown in too many parts of the country, the police are the first response, and they're completely inadequate and ill-trained to deal with that sort of thing. And they end up, you know, someone's suicidal, a friend calls the police because they're worried about them. The police show up with the SWAT team and kill them. That's not the way you want to resolve, you know, someone who's suicidal. So I do think there's this problem of asking police to do too much in that area. That said, you know, there's a group in Chicago whose name I'm going to forget right now. I can't remember them, but I want to talk about them because I think they're important. That we're doing this sort of intervention work. So when there was a murder, they would have people who, you know, used to be in gangs would go and they would talk to the people who were close to the people who were murdered. They would sort of negotiate with them. They would try to resolve these conflicts without guns, without weapons, without arrests. And what they found is when this group was funded, Cure Violence, it's called. When they found that this group was well funded, the neighborhoods in which they operated, the number of homicides dropped pretty dramatically. As soon as the city stopped funding this group or cut funding, severely cut the funding, shootings in those neighborhoods went right back up. And if you look at the actual sort of concurrent data and you break it down geographically in Chicago, you'll see that when Chicago had its homicide spike a few years ago, it was directly related to defunding this group called Cure Violence. So, you know, I'm a libertarian politically. I think people may see that kind of a solution as a kind of namby-pamby sort of, let's just talk it out kind of thing. But, you know, if it works, if sending unarmed counselors into these kinds of disputes that are causing lots of people to be killed is actually more successful than sending armed, you know, agents of the state into sort of knock heads, shouldn't we prefer that method? I mean, I think it's certainly a better way to go about it if we can prove that it works and it's better. And you know, the data that we've seen from Chicago and actually a lot of other cities have shown that what they do actually does work. So, you know, I do think, you know, I don't think if there's a bank robbery in progress, sending a social worker is going to do much help. But in terms of like actually preventing crime, police don't actually do a lot to prevent crime. They tend to address crimes after they happen. But these sorts of interventions do have a very good track record, and I think we should invest more in them.
Yeah, and I also think that there's I mean, I had an experience recently where I had a sort of minor league threat, and I thought it was appropriate to notify my local police department that it had happened. And, you know, the police department was politely useless on the subject, not in a bad way, because I don't think I'm not sure the situation merited a swift and intervention of any kind. So I don't want to criticize them for it, but I do think if I were a more vulnerable person than I am in terms of the ability to, frankly, buy whatever security I need. I think if I were, it would be surprising how little the police department was willing or able to do. And, that's not to say that I know what they should have done. And if I had been in charge of my local police precinct, I don't think I would have devoted any resources to protecting me under those circumstances. That said, I really noticed, how little prevention was part of the discussion. And it was kind of like, well, let us know, dude, if anything happens,
Yeah,
And,
tell that to any domestic violence victim, which is just
right.
kind of
So,
like, this guy keeps threatening my life. Pretty sure he's going to kill me. Pretty sure he's
right.
going to kill me. Pretty sure he's going to kill me.
Call us when he does. And that was definitely the tone of the thing. And so what is your response to that? Well, your response is invest a fair bit of money in technical solutions, which is just not available to the domestic violence abuse victim. And so there's, I do think like the balance of prevention and early intervention and response is a little bit off. Nate Perry, the floor is yours once you unmute yourself. Nate Perry, do you exist?
Always the question.
Nate Perry has a very good question.
He says he says, I'm here, mic issue. It might be a mic issue.
It might be a mic issue. Kate, why don't you read his question?
Sure. Nate asks, can you talk about the distinction in both media and police responses to campus protests versus protests generally? And I have thoughts on that because that's actually a First Amendment distinction too. And it seems like historically there is greater critical and widespread attention when police are abusive against protesters who are protesting at their schools, in contrast to protesters that occur elsewhere. So wait, he says, it seems like historically there is greater critical and widespread attention when police are abusive against protesters on campus versus protests that occur elsewhere. Do you agree with that, Radley?
Not sure. I mean, I don't. I can't even remember sort of a lot of campus.
I don't remember violence in campus protests.
I don't know, Kent State.
Well, no, yeah, but that's what I mean. It's been a while.
Yeah, it's usually these police brutality protests where we've seen this. I think one interesting contrast that a lot of people are pointing to is the protests on the protests at the Michigan Capitol, where you had white sort of right of center people with their guns, basically threatening the Michigan governor and the Michigan legislature, and actually I think they successfully prevented them from meeting at one point. And I think my sympathies lie much more with the protesters out this week than the protesters in Michigan. And I do think there's some merit to the argument that the police their sympathies probably lie more with the protesters in Michigan, particularly since the protests this week are against the police. But I also think there is something to be said about the fact that the protesters in Michigan carried guns. And I feel like if the police know that sort of treating you poorly is going to result in a possible, violent confrontation with people who are well armed, that's not a
good incentive to tell people, Nate.
No, but
Nate Radley.
But I do think it's a reality that we have to kind of acknowledge. And I remember 2 weeks ago, actually, some armed, new Black Panther members escorted Mr. Arbery's family in a march through the town, sort of for his case, or to draw attention to his case. And it was interesting because they were openly carrying. It was in the state of Georgia, and they weren't confronted by police. And it was a very small sort of demonstration, but I'm not advocating everybody bring a gun to the protest, but I do think it talks. I mean, I point out this in the book, and I pointed out in articles I've written. The police use SWAT teams to go after these low-level drug offenders, and they kick down the doors in the middle of the night. When they actually have a dangerous fugitive, when they actually have somebody who's a threat to shoot back, and they know that
they're extremely professional.
Right. They don't kick the door down. I point out this example in the book when they found Whitey Ford, a guy who had a couple dozen.
Yeah, that's a great example.
A guy who's like dying, who, if anybody was ever going to go out in a blaze of glory, and kill a bunch of cops to, secure his legacy or whatever, it was Whitey Ford. And what did they do when they found out where he was?
Whitey Bulger, right?
Or sorry, Whitey Ford.
I knew who he meant. Bulger. He's right. Yes, yeah.
Not the baseball player, the gangster.
Yeah, not the baseball player.
I was also kind of, I think, yes, but go ahead.
But so when they knew where he was, they found out that he had a storage locker in this apartment complex, and they told him somebody had broken into a storage locker and they needed to come down and sign some papers. And he came down and they arrested him without incident. They didn't kick the door down in the middle of the night. And I think there's something to that when we think about how they reacted in Michigan versus what we're seeing, over the last couple of days.
Let me ask you something else about Michigan versus the last couple of days, though, because I think I don't doubt that what you describe is part of the explanation, but I think also part of the explanation is notice. So if the new Black Panthers say, we're going to be marching with open carry to escort so-and-so, Mr. Arbery's family, that proceeds without incident. And if a bunch of Michigan militia types announce, we're going to be showing up in an open carry environment in the Capitol to look intimidating, that proceeds without incident from the cops. And some of the explanation for that is, I think, just that everybody knows they're going to do it. And so, and what makes this situation volatile is that nobody knows what's going to happen next. And so, though very few people are armed, you don't know as a cop, like with the Michigan militia types, you can say, all right, let them parade around with their guns. They'll parade around with their guns and then they'll go home. And that's more or less what happens. And so from an outsider perspective, it's a bunch of white people parading around with guns and being super intimidating. And the police just stand there and let them do it. But from a police perspective, it's exactly what they're expecting to happen.
Yep.
And what's scary about current protests, which are, of course, mostly unarmed people, and they're people who aren't trying to be intimidating, they're just trying to vent rage, and righteous rage. But the situation is volatile and unpredictable, which from a police perspective is very scary. How much of it is the cultural factor that you're describing, and how much of it is the sort of volatility, predictability factor that I'm describing?
I think it's definitely part of it. I mean, I wasn't trying to provide a catch-all sort of explanation for the difference in the reactions. I think notice is definitely part of it. I also think it's just, a lot of police officers in Michigan, I'm sure, identified more with the protesters there than they would, protesters in Detroit. I think they probably sympathize more with them as well. But yeah, I think, if you're in the middle of a protest and someone unexpectedly pulls out a gun, even in a legal open carry state, that's going to trigger, pardon the pun, a reaction of surprise and fear much more than if someone's sort of openly carrying from the start. I think that's right.
Yeah, I think that's right. Bradley, it's been so lovely to talk to you. I've missed you guys. I'm actually is Margaret Taylor going to give her send off?
No, I'm going to give Margaret the last word because Margaret is, among other things, funny.
Oh yeah, she's great.
Though her question was not funny, but Margaret is funny, and so she's going to get the last word, and she's going to get a moment to think about it because you were thanking our guest,
yes, okay,
Bradley
perfect.
Balco, and so this is going to give Margaret a few seconds to think about what the last word is going to be.
I'm going to say that, Bradley, I miss your dogs, and that also Liliana should come on this week to talk to us about the same things that you talked to us about. I will email her separately or send her a note, but just like prime her. And also,
Yeah,
are you still
definitely.
baking so much? Do you want some really, really good sourdough starter that it's like 35 years old?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been doing a lot of baking of breads and whatnot, but I haven't gotten on the sourdough thing yet. But
You had
we
like
my
what was the
we went
Instagram thing that you had going with like the beautiful babka, and then you had like the sausage roll, and like there was like all of these things, and everything made me feel like I would just be like rolled out the door.
well, a couple of years during the World Cup, I got this idea to try to make the sort of national bread of every country in the World Cup. Didn't quite get all the way through it, but no, we went to Paris for my wife's birthday over New Year's, and so I've been trying to make the perfect croissant. So that's been my quarantine mission so far.
I will say that the sourdough starter has been beloved by a bunch of French people that I sent to them. So
Well, I'm just afraid I would kill it. So I've got to learn how.
You
to
won't kill it. It does not die. It is actually amazing. I've forgotten it in my fridge for up to 35 days at a time, and like it's has not died yet. So yeah,
it's a little bit scary even.
Yeah, it's a biological weapon.
It raises one of those ancient Greek paradoxes, right? If you have a sourdough starter for 30 years and not a single yeast is one of the original yeast, is it the same sourdough starter?
Yes. Well, so say we all about generations of children and everything else.
Whiskey companies, they always have a little bit of one batch in the next batch, so they can say, they have continuity from the very first batch.
Yep.
Radley Balco, thanks so much for joining us. Margaret Taylor, what is the last word today?
So the last word is kumbaya. I fully support Kate Klonick's kumbaya moment, and I think baking and bread can bring this country together, and Kate, it is up to you. Bread will bring us together.
I support this. I don't know if bread will bring, but yes, I'm sure I'm into that. I'm into that. Bradley, you can help with that.
I'd be happy to. Breads of the world.
Yes, exactly. So
breads of the world unite. We will be back tomorrow. I have a cool idea for a little in lieu of fun project, which I'm going to raise with Kate tomorrow on the show.
We don't know who our guest is, do we?
Don't know who our guest is. Maybe I will invite the guest who I think should be the centerpiece of this project.
Yes, do that. And I'll invite Larry Lessig for Tuesday, and then Liliana for Wednesday or Thursday or Friday.
This guest is in Cambridge, England, and so may have some of the late night issues associated with being on In Lieu of Fun. But I will find us a guest for tomorrow. And until then, what do we say?
If you can't have fun with us, you can eat a lot of bread. See what I've done with this making me do the sign off, Ben, and putting all this weight on me. I just
because I accept that now you are going to forever on after just distort the sign off. And only it'll be like the original yeasts. They won't. Will we actually have an original sign off